The letter arrived at 8 in the morning while I was brushing cedar shavings off my overalls, getting ready to polish the grand banister of the historic Harborside Inn. No one was there to help me lift the heavy cans of varnish. I told everyone I had it under control because being the one who had things under control was the only identity I had left. I saw my cousin Julian's name on the return address and opened the envelope with my hands still covered in faint gray dust. He didn't write a warm greeting. It was typed, cold and formal, on the new corporate letterhead he'd ordered without telling me. The message was brief. The inn's grand reopening gala tonight was for selected investors only, and because my presence as the restoration carpenter might disrupt the high-end aesthetic, it was best if I stayed in the workshop. I pressed my palm flat against the cold pine workbench. How could they do this after everything I sacrificed? I whispered to the empty room. There was no one to answer. I almost believed I would spend that night hiding in the shadows of the harbor. I was wrong about who would be standing in that grand ballroom. So were they. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. I'm Clara. I'm 34, and for 18 months, I had quietly held my family's legacy together with my bare hands and my life savings until the morning my family told me to stay in the dark. I'm a historical restoration carpenter in a quiet coastal town in Maine. The kind of person people call when the old beams groan under the winter snow, or when a piece of the past is about to crumble into dust. This is the story of the grand opening they were certain I would watch from the window. Drop a comment below and please subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story about quiet strength. 18 months before that letter arrived, I sat on the porch of Heron's Landing Inn at 4 in the morning, listening to the tide pull the gravel back into the sea. My grandmother, Eleanor, had passed away just 3 days prior. She was the heartbeat of this town, the woman who kept the historic inn open for 40 years, welcoming weary travelers with fresh bread and stories of the old sailors. When her heart finally gave out, she left the old building to my Aunt Beatrice and my cousin Julian. But they didn't know how to fix a leaking roof. They didn't know the rhythm of the old boiler in the basement, and they certainly didn't know how to talk to the local fishermen who supplied our kitchen. So, without anyone asking, I became the one who handled the heavy lifting. I took my tools and moved into the small cottage behind the carriage house. I learned the language of the inn's ancient plumbing, the exact angle to shim the settlement cracks in the foundation, and the smell of the beeswax polish needed to keep the colonial-era oak from drying out under the harsh ocean air. I worked 14-hour days, getting sawdust in my hair, grease under my fingernails, and the scent of linseed oil deeply embedded into the fabric of my favorite coat. When the pipes froze in January, I was the one who crawled through the freezing mud under the floorboards to thaw them. When the local tax assessor threatened a lien on the property, I was the one who emptied my personal savings account, the money I had saved to open my own custom furniture shop, to pay the back taxes so the doors wouldn't be chained shut. It felt like honor, protecting my grandmother's memory like that. It took me a long time to realize that saving a sinking ship doesn't mean the passengers will offer you a dry towel when you finally reach the shore. You can be the only person keeping a roof over a family's head and still be the one they expect to wash the dishes in the dark. But back then, I thought my sweat was a language they understood. I thought if I kept building, eventually they would see the hands that held the hammer. That was my mistake, and it took a grand opening to show me. If you have ever been the invisible pillar holding up people who only see you as a footstool, comment, "I see the light right now," and stay with me. Because the way this story unfolds will show you exactly how to take your power back. My boyfriend Marcus found me on a rainy Thursday in the basement of the inn, my forehead pressed against the iron casing of the old boiler as I tried to bleed the air valves. He was a local boat builder, a man of few words but deep understanding, who spent his days shaping cedar planks for lobster boats. He sat down on a wooden crate next to me and didn't tell me to quit or try to fix my family. He just reached into his pocket, handed me a clean rag to wipe the rust off my cheek, and whispered that a hand that can build a ship can also steer it away from a storm. I wanted to believe him, but the loyalty to my grandmother's memory was a heavy anchor. 3 weeks before the scheduled grand reopening, I was sitting at my small kitchen table, reviewing the inn's ledger. I realized the commercial insurance premium was overdue, a bill that Julian was supposed to cover with the marketing funds he'd claimed from the state tourism grant. Instead, his social media pages were filled with photos of him at expensive dinners in Boston, branding himself as the visionary young hotelier of the Maine coast. I sighed, opened my banking app, and transferred the last $700 of my emergency fund to cover the insurance. It was a pattern I had repeated a dozen times. The work that keeps a business alive is never the work that gets posted on Instagram. My phone buzzed on the wood table. A text from Aunt Beatrice, polite but distant, the way she always sounded when she wanted to soften a blow. Clara, dear, about the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Julian thinks we should keep the photo opportunities focused on the executive partners to project a polished corporate image. Let's discuss your role later. Later. They had been saying later for 2 months whenever I asked about my share of the partnership or the wages I had deferred to pay the local suppliers. I set the phone face down, feeling a cold chill that had nothing to do with the ocean wind. Marcus looked up from his drawing board like he was designing a new skiff. They are going to sell it, Clara, he said softly. A man doesn't buy a $3,000 suit for a local ribbon cutting unless he's trying to impress a buyer. I didn't want to believe him. The inn was family land. It had been in our name for 3 generations, but my father's family had a history of avoiding hard truths, and my Aunt Beatrice was a master of selling the soil beneath her feet to buy a temporary shine. Aunt Beatrice showed up at my workshop that Friday. She didn't knock. She just pushed the heavy oak door open, bringing the cold autumn air and the scent of expensive perfume that smelled completely out of place among the scent of pine shavings. She had Julian's young daughter Maya with her. Maya was 9 and loved to watch me carve wooden birds. She ran over and hugged my waist while her grandmother stood near the door, carefully keeping her designer coat away from my dusty table. Clara, Beatrice began in that airy, tragic voice she used when she wanted to ask for a favor while pretending she was doing me a kindness. The caterers are asking for an additional $500 deposit for the local seafood platters, and Julian's business account is temporarily locked due to a minor administrative error. Could you possibly write them a quick check? We'll settle up as soon as the Gala investors sign their commitments. I looked at my bank balance on my phone. There was exactly $600 left in my active account. I wrote the check because I couldn't bear the thought of the local fishermen, men I had known my whole life, being turned away without their payment. Beatrice took the check, slipped it into her leather bag, and then, as she turned to leave, she casually dropped the anchor. You know, Clara, your grandmother always worried about your stubbornness. She used to say you lacked the social grace to run a real establishment. That's why we're taking the lead on this. We want to protect you from your own limitations. I stood frozen, holding a dry chisel in my hand. It was the ultimate leverage. They knew how much I craved my grandmother's approval, and they were using her ghost to keep me in my place. She kissed my cheek with cold lips, gathered Maya, and left the workshop, leaving me with $100 balance and a heavy chest. She had found the one wound that hadn't healed, and she was turning the knife. I didn't wait. I am not the kind of woman who watches the water rise without looking for a leak. That same evening, I walked up the stone path to the main inn. The grand chandelier in the foyer was lit, casting long shadows across the historic pine floorboards I had spent 3 weeks sanding on my knees. I found Julian in the library sipping scotch and talking to a man in a tailored gray suit. The man was holding a thick folder with the logo of Vance Developments, a massive corporate firm known for turning historic coastal properties into sterile luxury condos. I stood in the doorway, my boots still wet from the harbor fog. Julian, I said, keeping my voice calm and steady. We need to talk about the future of Heron's Landing. Julian looked up, his face tightening with irritation. Not now, Clara. We are in the middle of an important meeting. Go back to the workshop. I didn't move. This is my family's inn, too. Grandmother wanted this place to remain a haven for the community. The man in the suit smiled a cold, professional smile, stood up, and slipped the folder into his briefcase. I'll leave you to your family matters, Julian. We'll finalize the terms at the gala tomorrow night. Once the door closed, Julian turned on me, his face red. Are you trying to ruin this for us? Do you have any idea what this deal means? We are selling the property for $3 million. Beatrice and I will finally be free of this drafty old money pit. I felt the room tilt. And what about the community? What about the local craftspeople, the fishermen, the history? Julian laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. History doesn't pay the country club dues, Clara. You've spent 18 months playing carpenter, but you're just a laborer. You don't own the deed. Grandmother left the property to Mom and me. You have no say here. Now get back to your wood shavings and let the professionals handle the future. I walked back to my cottage in the dark, the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the rocks sounding like a warning. The words from his mouth sat in my mind like rusted nails. You're just a laborer. You don't own the deed. I had spent 18 months keeping the roof over their heads, and they were preparing to hand the keys to a wrecking ball. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I went to my filing cabinet and pulled out the thick ledger of my own business, Clara's Restoration and Design. I started to list every single invoice I had paid out of my own pocket, every hour of specialized historical preservation work I had performed, and every custom fixture I had hand-built for the inn. The hand-carved mahogany mantelpiece in the grand salon, the historic replication doors, the custom brass hardware I had sourced and restored, all of it had been billed under my independent contractor license with the invoices marked as deferred payment pending the inn's reopening. I had kept the receipts. I had kept the structural engineering certificates that were registered in my name because I was the one who signed the permits. I looked at the folder. It was a legal and financial mountain. I could file a mechanics lien against the property tomorrow, which would freeze any sale or transfer of the deed for months, stopping the Vance development deal dead in its tracks. The power was in my hands. The fantasy of walking into their fancy dinner, throwing the folder onto the table, and watching Julian's face turn white was incredibly tempting. I wanted them to feel the panic I had felt. I wanted them to realize that the ground they were standing on was entirely built by the sister they had dismissed. My friend Sarah, who ran the local bakery, came by the next morning with warm biscuits, and I showed her the file. Her eyes went wide. "Clara, do it. Stop the sale. Make them pay for what they did to you." And I wanted to. I really did. But as I held that manila folder in my lap, I realized something that changed everything. My grandmother Eleanor didn't love this inn because of the wood and the stone. She loved it because of the people who gathered inside it. If I fought my family in a public court, I would be dragging her legacy through the mud, turning her lifetime of love into a bitter tabloid story for the local paper. I would be fighting them on their level, using their weapons of greed and spite. And more than that, I realized that even if I won, even if I forced them to pay me, they would never truly see my worth. You cannot force people to appreciate the light while they are busy trying to put it out. The folder wasn't my weapon, it was my exit ticket. The afternoon before the gala, I made a quiet phone call to Arthur, the old boat builder. Arthur's family had owned the historic timber mill at the edge of the harbor for 90 years, but it had fallen into disrepair after his retirement. I had spent 2 weeks the previous autumn volunteering my time to stabilize the mill's water wheel and reinforce the oak rafters, simply because I couldn't bear to see a piece of our town's history collapse. When I called him, his voice was warm and thick with the Maine accent. "Clara girl, I've been hearing whispers in town about what's happening up at the inn. Those folks don't deserve your hands." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Arthur, I need a place to work. I need to start over." There was a brief silence, then the sound of him clearing his throat. "The old mill is yours, Clara. No rent for the first 2 years. You saved that roof, and now it's time that roof kept you dry. We'll get the power turned back on by Monday." I sat on my porch and wept. Not from sadness, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that the community I had quietly served was ready to catch me. I had been planting seeds of kindness in the rocky soil of this town for years, and now, when my own garden was being burned down, a new field was opening up for me. That evening, while Julian and Beatrice were in town getting their hair styled for the big night, I went into the inn with my toolbox and my flatbed truck. I didn't steal anything. I simply reclaimed what was legally mine. I uninstalled the hand-carved mahogany mantelpiece from the fireplace in the grand salon, a masterpiece that had taken me 3 months of intricate carving to complete, and which was specifically registered as my personal property under the deferred payment agreement. I removed the historic replica doors I had crafted for the main entrance, replacing them with the standard plywood construction doors that had been there before. I gathered my tools, my custom brass light fixtures, and my grandmother's personal antique writing desk, which I had restored with my own hands. I loaded everything onto the truck, covered it with a heavy canvas tarp, and drove it down to Arthur's Mill. By midnight, the grand salon of Heron's Landing Inn looked hollow and unfinished, a cold draft whistling through the temporary plywood entrance doors. I returned to my cottage, opened my computer, and canceled the auto draft authorization for the inn's commercial liability insurance. I sent a formal email to Julian, Beatrice, and their legal counsel, attaching a copy of the mechanic's lien waiver alongside a detailed invoice for my services with a clear note. I have reclaimed my custom fixtures in lieu of unpaid wages. The property is now returned to its original state. You are free to sell the building, but you are no longer authorized to use my craftsmanship, my licenses, or my financial backing to do so. Good luck with the opening. I hit send, and for the first time in 18 months, the tightness in my shoulders vanished. I slept like a baby. The next day, the town was buzzing. The grand reopening gala was scheduled for 7 in the evening. I spent my afternoon at the old mill with Marcus, sweeping the floors, setting up my workbench, and positioning my grandmother's writing desk near the large window overlooking the water. The space was beautiful, filled with the smell of old pine and the honest history of honest work. At 6 o'clock, Marcus helped me into my favorite green linen dress. I didn't have high society diamonds, but I had a necklace made of sea glass that my grandmother had given me when I was a child. We walked down to the mill's dock where Arthur had set up string lights, and local fishermen had brought 2 barrels of fresh oysters and a keg of local cider. We hadn't planned a protest, we had simply planned a gathering for the people who actually built this town. By 7, the dock was crowded with familiar faces: the bakers, the plumbers, the sailors, the neighbors who had known me since I was a little girl running through the sawdust. They had bypassed the Grand Inn entirely, choosing instead to walk down to the old harbor mill to celebrate a new beginning with the girl who had always shown up for them. Meanwhile, up the hill at Heron's Landing, the scene was very different. As the wealthy investors and corporate executives from Vance Developments arrived, they were greeted not by a polished historic masterpiece, but by a drafty, unfinished building with plywood doors and a cold, empty fireplace where the magnificent mahogany mantelpiece should have been. The heating system, which I had kept running through constant personal maintenance, had failed because Julian didn't know how to bleed the air valves, leaving the grand ballroom freezing. The guests stood in their expensive suits, shivering in the drafty room, looking at the hollow spaces on the walls. Julian and Beatrice were frantic, trying to explain to the developers why the historic charm they had promised was completely missing. When the lead developer saw the state of the building and realized the historical preservation certificates had been withdrawn because the structural work was no longer certified under my active license, his face turned to stone. "This isn't a luxury heritage resort," he told Julian, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "This is a drafty fixer-upper with legal complications. The deal is off." At that moment, Julian looked out the high windows of the inn, down toward the harbor. He saw the warm gold glow of the string lights at the old mill, heard the faint sound of laughter and music drifting up through the fog, and saw the entire community gathered around his sister. He walked down the hill alone, his expensive leather shoes getting ruined in the wet grass. He stood at the edge of our dock, looking smaller and colder than I had ever seen him. He tried to speak, his voice shaking. "Clara, the developers pulled out. The inn is ruined. Why did you do this to us?" I walked to the edge of the dock and looked down at him, my hand resting comfortably in Marcus's warm grip. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I didn't ruin anything, Julian," I said, my voice as calm as the harbor before dawn. "I just took my hands off the walls. You told me to know my place, and I finally did. My place isn't holding up people who only see me when they need a repair. My place is here, building something real with the people who actually value the work." He stood there, the cold wind whipping his hair, realizing for the first time that the luxury life he had tried to sell was built entirely on a foundation he had treated like dirt. He turned and walked back up the hill into the dark, and I never looked back. The old mill is now a thriving workshop, and every piece of furniture I make carries the scent of cedar and the strength of a town that chose to stand with me. If you are holding up a structure that doesn't respect your hands, set it down. Let it feel its own weight, and watch how fast the right doors open when you finally decide to stand in your own light.